Chapter 3 "The lad is in an evil plight," said Gorgias, shaking his head thoughtfully as the equipage rolled over the stone pavement of the Street of the King. "And over yonder," added Dion, "the prospect is equally unpleasing. Philostratus is setting the people crazy, but the hired mischief-maker will soon wish he had been less ready to seize Iris's gold coins." "And to think," cried the architect, "that Barine was this scoundrel's wife! How could it be—" "She was but a child when they married her," interrupted Dion. "Who consults a girl of 15 in the choice of a husband? And Philostratus, he was my classmate at Rhodus, at that time had the fairest prospects. His brother Alexis, Antony's favorite, could easily advance him. Barine's father was dead, her mother was accustomed to follow Didymus's counsel, and the clever fellow had managed to strew dust in the old man's eyes. Long and lank as he is not bad-looking even now." When he appeared as an orator, he pleased his hearers. This turned his head, and a spendthrift's blood runs in his veins. To bring his fair young bride to a stately mansion, he undertook the bad cause of the thievish tax-collector Pyrrhus, and cleared him. He bought a dozen false witnesses. There were 16. Afterwards they became as numerous as the open mouths you see shouting yonder. It is time to silence them. Go to the old man's house and soothe him, Barine also, if she is there. If you find messengers from the regent, raise objections to the unprecedented decree. You know the portions of the law which can be turned to Didymus's advantage. Since the reign of Evergetes II, registered landed property has been unassailable, and his was recorded. So much the better. Tell the officials also, confidentially, that you know of objections just discovered which may perhaps change the regent's views. And above all, I shall insist upon my right to choose the place for the twin statues. The queen herself directed the others to heed my opinion. That will cast the heaviest weight into the scale. We shall meet later. You will prefer to keep away from Barine tonight. If you see her, tell her that Archibius said he would visit her later. For an object I will explain afterwards. I shall probably go to Iris to bring her to reason. It will be better not to mention Caesarion's wish." "Certainly. And you will give nothing to yonder brawler." "On the contrary, I feel very generous. If Pytho will aid me, the insatiate fellow will get more than may be agreeable to him." Then, grasping the architect's hand, Dion forced his way through the throng surrounding the high platform on wheels, upon which the closely covered piece of sculpture had been rolled up. The gate of the scholar's house stood open, for an officer in the regent's service had really entered a short time before, but the Scythian guards sent by the exegetus Demetrius, one of Barine's friends, were keeping back the throng of curious spectators. Their commander knew Gorgias, and he was soon standing in the impluvium of the scholar's house, an oblong, roofless space with a fountain in the center, whose spray moistened the circular bed of flowers around it. The old slave had just lightened some 3-branched lamps which burned on tall stands. The officers sent by the regent to inform Didymus that his garden would be converted into a public square had just arrived. When Gorgias entered, these magistrates, their clerks, and the witnesses accompanying them, a group of 20 men, at whose head was Apollonius, a distinguished officer of the royal treasury, were in the house. The slave who admitted the architect informed him of it. In the atrium, a young girl, doubtless a member of the household, stopped him. He was not mistaken in supposing that she was Helena, Didymus's younger granddaughter, of whom Barine had spoken. True, she resembled her sister neither in face nor figure, for while the young matron's hair was fair and waving, the young girl's thick black tresses were wound around her head in a smooth braid. Very unlike Barine's voice, too, were the deep, earnest tones trembling with emotion, in which she confronted him with the brief question, concealing a faint reproach. "Another demand?" After first ascertaining that he was really speaking to Helena, his friend's sister, he hastily told her his name, adding that, on the contrary, he had come to protect her grandfather from a serious misfortune. When his glance first rested upon her in the dimly lighted room, the impression she made upon him was by no means favorable. The pure brow, which seemed to him too high for a woman's face, wore an indignant frown, and though her mouth was beautiful in form, its outlines were often marred by a passionate tremor that lent the exquisitely chiseled features a harsh, nay, bitter expression. But she had scarcely heard the motive of his presence ere, pressing her hand upon her bosom with a sigh of relief, she eagerly exclaimed, "Oh, do what you can to avert this terrible deed. No one knows how the old man loves this house. And my grandmother! They will die if it is taken from them." Her large eyes rested upon him with a warm, imploring light, and the stern, almost repellent voice thrilled with love for her relatives. He must lend his aid here, and how gladly he would do so. He assured her of this, and Helena, who had heard him mentioned as a man of ability, saw in him a helper in need, and begged him, with touching fervor, to show her grandfather when he came before the officers that all was not lost. The astonished architect asked if Didymus did not know what was impending, and Helena hastily replied, "He is working in the summer house by the sea. Apollonius is a kind-hearted man, and will wait until I have prepared my grandfather. I must go to him. He has already sent Philotas, his pupil, who finds and unrolls his books, a dozen times to inquire the cause of the tumult outside. But I replied that the crowds were flocking to the harbor on account of the queen. There is often a mob shouting madly, but nothing disturbs my grandfather when he is absorbed in his work, and his pupil, a young student from Amphissa, loves him and does what I bid him. My grandmother, too, knows nothing yet. She is deaf, and the female slaves dare not tell her." After her recent attack of giddiness, the doctor said that any sudden shock might injure her. "If only I can find the right words, that my grandfather may not be too sorely hurt." "Shall I accompany you?" asked Gorgias kindly. "No," she answered hurriedly. "He needs time ere he will trust strangers. Only, if Apollonius discloses the terrible truth, and his grief threatens to overpower him, comfort him, and show him that we still have friends who are ready to protect us from such disaster." She waved her hand in token of gratitude, and hurried through the little side gate into the garden. Gorgias looked after her with sparkling eyes, and drew a long breath. How good this girl must be! How wisely she cared for her relatives! How energetically the young creature behaved! He had seen his new acquaintance only in the dim light, but she must be beautiful. Her eyes, lips, and hair certainly were. How his heart throbbed as he asked himself the question whether this young girl, who was endowed with every gift which constituted the true worth of womanhood, was not preferable to her more attractive sister Barine. When the thought darted through his mind that he had cause to be grateful to the beard which covered his chin and cheeks, for he felt that he, a sedate, mature man, must have blushed. And he knew why. Only half an hour before he had felt and admitted to Dion that he considered Barine the most desirable of women, and now another's image cast a deep shadow over hers and filled his heart with new, perhaps stronger, emotions. He had had similar experiences only too often, and his friends, Dion at their head, had perceived his weakness and spoiled many an hour for him by their biting jests. The series of tall and short, fair and dark beauties who had fired his fancy was indeed of considerable length, and every one on whom he had bestowed his quickly kindled affections had seemed to him the one woman he must make his own, if he would be a happy man. But ere he had reached the point of offering his hand, the question had arisen in his mind whether he might not love another still more ardently. So he had begun to persuade himself that his heart yearned for no individual, but the whole sex, at least the portion which was young and could feel love, and therefore he would scarcely be wise to bind himself to any one. True, he knew that he was capable of fidelity, for he clung to his friends with changeless loyalty, and was ready to make any sacrifice in their behalf. With women, however, he dealt differently. Was Helena's image, which now floated before him so bewitchingly, destined to fade as swiftly? The contrary would have been remarkable. Yet he firmly believed that this time Eros meant honestly by him. The laughing loves who twined their rose garlands around him and Helena's predecessors had nothing to do with this grave maiden. These reflections darted through his brain with the speed of lightning, and still stirred his heart when he was ushered into the impluvium, where the magistrates were impatiently awaiting the owner of the house. With the lucidity peculiar to him, he explained his reasons for hoping that their errand would be vain, and Apollonius replied that no one would rejoice more than he himself if the regent should authorize him, on the morrow, to countermand his mission. He would gladly wait there longer to afford the old man's granddaughter an opportunity to soften the tidings of the impending misfortune. The kind-hearted man's patience, however, was not tested too long, for when Helena entered the summer house, Didymus had already been informed of the disaster which threatened him and his family. The philosopher, Euphranor, an elderly member of the museum, had reached him through the garden gate, and, spite of Philotas's warning sign, told him what was occurring. But Didymus knew the old philosopher, who, a recluse from the world like himself, was devoting the remainder of his life and strength to the pursuit of science. So he only shook his head incredulously, pushed back the thin locks of gray hair which hung down on his cheeks over the barest part of his skull, and exclaimed reproachfully, though as if the matter under discussion was of the most trivial importance, "What have you been hearing? We'll see about it." He had risen as he spoke, and too abruptly surprised by the news to remember the sandals on the mat and the upper robe which lay on a chest of drawers at the end of the room, he was in the act of quitting it, when his friend, who had silently watched his movements, stopped him, and Helena entered. The gray-haired sage turned to her, and, vexed by his friend's doubts, begged her to convince her grandfather that even matters which do not please us may nevertheless be of some importance. She did so as considerately as possible, thinking meanwhile of the architect and his hopes. Didymus, with his eyes bent on the ground, shook his gray head again and again. Then, suddenly raising it, he rushed to the door, and without heeding the upper garment which Helena still held in her hand, tore it open, shouting, "But things must and shall be changed." Euphranor and his granddaughter followed. Though his head was bowed, he crossed the little garden with a swift, firm tread, and without noticing the questions and warnings of his companions, walked at once to the impluvium. The bright light dazzled his weakened eyes, and his habit of gazing into vacancy or on the ground compelled him to glance from side to side for some time, ere he could accustom himself to it. Apollonius approached, greeted him respectfully, and assured him that he deeply regretted having interrupted him in the work for which the whole world was waiting, but he had come on important business. I know," the old scholar answered with a smile of superiority. "What is all this ado about?" As he spoke, he looked around the group of spectators, among whom he knew no one except Apollonius, who had charge of the museum accounts, and the architect, for whom he had composed the inscription on the odium, which he had recently built. But when his eyes met only unfamiliar faces, the confidence which hitherto had sustained him began to waver. Though still convinced that a demand such as the philosopher suggested could not possibly be made upon him, he continued, "It is stated that there is a plan for turning my garden into a public square. And for what purpose? To erect a piece of sculpture? But there can be nothing serious in the rumor, for my property is recorded in the land register, and the law—" "Pardon me," Apollonius broke in, "if I interrupt you. We know the ordinance to which you refer, but this case is an exceptional one. The regent desires to take nothing from you. On the contrary, he offers, in the name of the Queen, any compensation you yourself may fix for the piece of land which is to be honored by the statues of the highest personages in the country, Cleopatra and Antony, hand in hand. The piece of sculpture has already been brought here. A work by the admirable artist Lysander, who passed too early to the netherworld, certainly will not disfigure your house. The little summer house by the sea must be removed tomorrow, it is true. You know that our gracious Queen may return any day, victorious if the immortals are just. This piece of sculpture, which is created in her honor to afford her pleasure, must greet her on her arrival. So the regent sent me today to communicate his wish, which, as he represents the Queen— Yes, interrupted the architect, who had again warmly assured the old man's granddaughter of his aid. Yet your friends will endeavor to persuade the regent to find another place for the statues. They are at liberty to do so, said the officer. What will happen later the future will show. My office merely requires me to induce the worthy owner of this house and garden to submit today to the Queen's command, which the regent and my own heart bid me clothe in the form of a request. During this conversation, the old man had at first listened silently to the magistrate's words, gazing intently into his face. So it was true. The demand to yield up his garden, and even the little house, for 50 years the scene of his study and creative work, for the sake of a statue, would be made. Since this had become a certainty, he had stood with his eyes fixed upon the ground. Grief had paralyzed his tongue, and Helena, who felt this, for the aged head seemed as if it were bending under a heavy burden, had drawn close to his side. The shouts and howls of the throng outside echoed through the open roof of the impluvium, but the old man did not seem to hear them, and did not even notice his granddaughter. Yet no sooner did he feel her touch than he hurriedly shrank away, flung back his drooping head, and gazed around the circle of intruders. The dull, questioning eyes of the old commentator and writer of many books now blazed with the hot fire of youthful passion, and, like a wrestler who seeks the right grip, he measured Apollonius and his companions with wrathful glances. The fragile recluse seemed transformed into a warrior ready for battle. His lips and the nostrils of his delicate nose quivered, and when Apollonius began to say that it would be wise to remove the contents of the summer house that day, as it would be torn down early the next morning, Didymus raised his arms, exclaiming, "That will not be done. Not a single roll shall be removed. They will find me at work as usual early tomorrow morning, and if it is still your wish to rob me of my property, you must use violence to attain your purpose." "Calm yourself," replied Apollonius. "Every one beneath the moon must submit to a higher power. The gods bow to destiny, we mortals to the sovereign. You are a sage. I, merely mindful of the behests of duty, administer my office. But I know life, and if I may offer my counsel, you will accept what cannot be averted, and I will wager 10 to 1 that you will have the best of it, that the Queen will place in your hands means— "Sufficient to build a palace on the site of the little house of which I was robbed," Didymus interrupted bitterly. Then rage burst forth afresh. "What do I care for your money? I want my rights, my good, guaranteed rights. I insist upon them, and whoever assails the ground which my grandfather and father bequeathed to me—" He hesitated, for the throng outside had burst into a loud shout of joy, and when it died away, and the old man began once more defiantly to claim his rights, he was interrupted by a woman's clear tones, addressing him with the Greek greeting, "Rejoice!" A voice so gay and musical that it seemed to dispel the depression which rested like a gray fog on the whole company. While Didymus was listening to the excited populace, and the newcomer was gazing at the old man, whose rigid obstinacy could scarcely be conquered by kindness, the younger men were looking at the beautiful woman who joined them. Her haste had flushed her cheeks, and from beneath the turquoise-blue kerchief that covered her fair locks, a bewitching face smiled at her sister, the architect, and her grandfather. Apollonius and many of his companions felt as if happiness in person had entered this imperiled house, and many an eye brightened when the infuriated old man exclaimed in an altered tone, "You here, Barine?" And she, without heeding the presence of the others, kissed his cheek with tender affection. Helena, Gorgias, and the old philosopher Euphranor had approached her, and when the latter asked with loving reproach, "Why, Barine, how did you get through the howling mob?" she answered gaily, "That a learned member of the museum may receive me with the query whether I am here, though from childhood a kind, or, what do you think, grandfather, a malign fate has preserved me from being overlooked, and someone else reprovingly asks how I passed through the shouting mob, as if it were a crime to wade into the water to hold out a helping hand to those we love best when it is up to their chins. But oh, dear, this howling is too hideous." While speaking, she pressed her little hands on the part of the kerchief which concealed her ears, and said no more until the noise subsided, although she declared that she was in a hurry and had only come to learn how matters were. Meanwhile, it seemed as if she was so full of quick, pulsing life that it was impossible to leave even a moment unused, if it were merely to bestow or answer a friendly glance. The architect and her sister were obliged to return hurried answers to hasty questions, and as soon as she ascertained what had brought the strangers there, she thanked Apollonius, and said that old friends would do their best to spare her grandfather such a sorrow. In reply to repeated inquiries from the two old men in regard to her arrival there, she answered, "Nobody will believe it, because in this hurry I could not keep my mouth shut, but I acted like a mute fish and reached the water." Then, drawing her grandfather aside, she whispered to him that, when she left her boat at the harbor, Archibius had seen her from his carriage, and instantly stopped it to inform her of his intended visit that evening. He was coming to discuss an important matter. Therefore she must receive the worthy man, whom she sincerely liked, so she could not stay. Then, turning to the others, still with her kerchief on her head ready for departure, she asked what the people meant by their outcries. The architect replied that Philostratus had endeavored to make the crowd believe that the only appropriate site for the statues of which she had heard was her grandfather's garden, and he thought he knew in whose behalf the fellow was acting. "Certainly not in the regent's," said Apollonius, in a tone of sincere conviction, but Barine, over whose sunny brow a shadow had flitted when Gorgias uttered the orator's name, assented with a slight bend of the head, and then whispered hurriedly, yet earnestly, that she would answer for the old man's allowing himself to be persuaded, if he had only time to collect his thoughts. The next morning, when the market was crowded, the officer might commence his negotiations afresh, if the regent insisted on his plan. Meanwhile, she would do her best to persuade her grandfather to yield, though he was not exactly one of the class who were easily guided. Apollonius might remind the regent that it would be advisable at this time to avoid a public scandal, to remember Didymus's age and the validity of his claim. While Apollonius was talking with his companions, Barine beckoned to the architect, and hastily took leave of the others, protesting that she was in no danger, since she would slip away again like a fish. Only this time she would use her tongue, and hoped by its means to win to the support of Didymus's just cause a man who would already have ended all the trouble, had the queen only been in Alexandria. Until now the eyes and ears of the whole company had been fixed upon Barine. No one had desired anything better than to gaze at and listen to her. Not until she had quitted the room with Gorgias did the officials discuss the matter together, and soon after Apollonius went away with his companions, to hold another conference with the regent about this unpleasant business. This time the architect had followed the young beauty with very mingled feelings. Only an hour before he would have rejoiced to be permitted to accompany and protect Barine. Now he would have gladly remained with her sister, who had returned his farewell greeting so gratefully and yet with such maidenly modesty. But even the most vacillating man cannot change one fancy for another, as he would replace a black piece on the draught board with a white one, and he still found it delightful to be so near Barine. Only the thought that Helena might believe that he stood on very intimate terms with her sister had darted with a disquieting influence through his brain when the latter invited him to accompany her. In the garden, Barine begged him, before they went to the landing place where the boat was moored, to help her ascend the narrow flight of steps leading to the flat roof of the gatekeeper's little house. Here they could watch unseen the tumult in the square below, for it was surrounded by dense laurel bushes. Bright flames were blazing in the pitch pans before the two temples at the side of the corner of the Muses, and their light was increased by the torches held in the hands of the Scythians. Yet no individuals could be distinguished in the throng. The marble walls of the temples shimmered, the statues at Didymus's gate, and the Hermé along the street of the king which passed the threatened house and connected the north of the corner of the Muses with the seashore, loomed from the darkness in the brilliancy of the reflected light, but the smoke of the torches darkened the sky and dimmed the starlight. The only persons distinctly visible were Dion, who had stationed himself on the lofty framework of the platform on which the muffled statues had been drawn hither, and the attorney Philostratus, who stood on the pedestal of one of the dolphins which surrounded the fountain between the temple of Isis and the street. The space, a dozen paces wide, which divided them, permitted the antagonists to understand each other, and the attention of the whole throng was fixed upon the wranglers. These verbal battles were one of the greatest pleasures of the Alexandrians, and they greeted every clever turn of speech with shouts of applause, every word which displeased them with groans, hisses, and catcalls. Barine could see and hear what was passing below. She had pushed aside the foliage of the laurel bushes which concealed her, and with her hand raised to her ear, stood listening to the two disputants, when the scoundrel whom she had called husband, and for whom her contempt had become too deep for hate, sneeringly assailed her family as having been fed from generation to generation from the corn bin of the museum, she bit her lips. But soon they curled, as if what she heard aroused her disgust, for the speaker now turned to Dion and accused him of preventing the kindly disposed regent from increasing the renown of the great queen and affording her noble heart a pleasure. "My tongue," he cried, "is the tool which supports me. Why am I using it here till it is weary and almost paralyzed? In honor of Cleopatra, our illustrious queen, and her generous friend, to whom we all owe a debt of gratitude. Let all who love her and the divine Antony, the new Heracles and Dionysus, both will soon make their entry among us crowned with the laurels of victory, join the regent and every well-disposed person in seizing yonder bit of land, so meanly withheld by base avarice and a sentiment, do you hear, which I do not name more plainly, simply because wickedness is repulsive to me, and I do not stand here as an accuser. Whoever upholds the word-monger who spouts forth books as the dolphin at my side does water, may do so. I shall not envy him. But first look at Didymus's ally and panegyrist. There he stands opposite to me. It would have been better for him had the dolphin at his feet taught him silence. Then he might have remained in the obscurity which befits him. But whether willing or not, I must drag him forth, and I will show you Dion, fellow citizens, though I would far rather have you see things which arouse less ire. The dim light prevents your distinguishing the color of his robe, but I know it, for I saw it in the glare of day. It is hyacinthine purple. You know what that costs. It would support the wives and children of many among you for 10 long years. How heavy must be the purse which can expose such a treasure to sun and rain, is the thought of everyone who sees him strutting about as proudly as a peacock. And his purse is loaded with many talents. Only it is a pity that, day after day, most of you must give your children a little less bread, and deprive yourselves of many a draught of wine to deck him out so bravely. His father, Eumenes, was a tax collector, and what the leech extorted from you and your children, the son now uses to drive, clad in hyacinthine purple, a 4-horse chariot, which splashes the mire from the street into your faces as it rolls onward. By the dog, the gentleman does not weigh so very much, yet he needs 4 horses to drag him. And, fellow citizens, do you know why? I'll tell you. He's afraid of sticking fast everywhere, even in his speech. Here Philostratus lowered his voice, for the phrase "sticking fast" had drawn a laugh from some of his hearers. But Dion, whose father had really amassed in the high position of a receiver of taxes the handsome fortune which his son possessed, did not delay his reply. "Yes, yes," he retorted scornfully, "yonder Syrian babbler hit the mark this time. He stands before me, and who does not easily stick fast when marsh and mire are so near? As for the hyacinthine purple cloak, I wear it because I like it. His crocus yellow one is less to my taste, though he certainly looks fine enough in it in the sunlight. It shines like a buttercup in the grass. You know the plant. When it fades, and I ask whether you think Philostratus looks like a bud, when it fades, it leaves a hollow spiral ball which a child's breath could blow away. Suppose in future we should call the round buttercup seed vessels Philostratus heads. You like the suggestion? I am glad, fellow citizens, and I thank you. It proves your good taste. Then we will stick to the comparison. Every head contains a tongue, and Philostratus says that his is the tool which supports him. Hear the money-bag, the despiser of the people, interrupted Philostratus furiously. The honest toil by which a citizen earns a livelihood is a disgrace in his eyes. Honest toil, my good friend, replied Dion, is scarcely in question here. I spoke only of your tongue. You understand me, fellow citizens, or, if any of you are not yet acquainted with this worthy man, I will show him to you, for I know him well. He is my foe, yet I can sincerely recommend him to many of you. If anyone has a very bad, shamefully corrupt cause to bring before the courts, I most earnestly counsel him to apply to the buttercup man perched on yonder fountain. He will thank me for it. Believe me, Didymus's cause is just, precisely because this advocate so eagerly assails it. I told you just now the matter under discussion. Which of you who owns a garden can say in future, "It is mine," if, during the absence of the queen, it is allowable to take it away to be used for any other purpose? But this is what threatens Didymus. If this is to be the custom here, let every one beware of sowing a radish, or planting a bush or a tree. For should the wife of some great noble desire to dry her linen there, he may be deprived of it ere the former can ripen, or the latter give shade. Loud applause followed this sentence, but Philostratus shouted in a voice that echoed far and wide, "Hear me, fellow citizens. Do not allow yourselves to be deceived. No one is to be robbed here. The project is to purchase, at a high price, the spot which the city needs for her adornment, and to honor and please the queen. Are the regent and the citizens to lose this opportunity of expressing the gratitude of years, and the rejoicing over the greatest of victories, of which we shall soon hear, because an evil-disposed person, the word must be uttered, a foe to his country, opposes it?" "Now the mire is coming too near me," Dion angrily responded, "and I might really stick fast, as I was warned. For I do not envy the ready presence of mind of any person whose tongue would not falter when the basest slander scattered its venom over him. You all know, fellow citizens, through how many generations the Didymus family has lived to the honor of this city, doing praiseworthy work in yonder house. You know that the good old man who dwells there was one of the teachers of the royal children. And yet, cried Philostratus, only the day before yesterday he walked arm in arm in the Paneum garden with Arius, the tutor of Octavianus, our own and our queen's most hated foe. In my presence, and before I know not how many others, Didymus distinguished this Arius as his most beloved pupil." "To give you that title," retorted Dion, "would certainly fill any teacher with shame and anger, no matter how far you had surpassed him in wisdom and knowledge. Nay, had you been committed to the care of the herring dealers instead of the rhetoricians, every honest man among them would disown you, for they sell only good wares for good money, while you give the poorest in exchange for glittering gold. This time you trample underfoot the fair name of an honorable man, but I will not suffer it. And you hear, fellow citizens, I now challenge this Syrian to prove that Didymus ever betrayed his native land, or I will brand him in your presence a base slanderer, an infamous, venal, destroyer of character. An insult from such lips is easily borne, replied Philostratus, in a tone of scornful superiority. But there was a pause ere he again turned to the listening throng, and with all the warmth he could throw into his voice continued, What do I desire, then, fellow citizens? What is the sole object of my words? I stand here with clean hands, impelled solely by the impulse of my heart to plead for the Queen. In order to secure the only suitable site for the statues to be erected to Cleopatra's honor and fame, I enter into judgment with her foes, expose myself to the insult with which boastful insolence is permitted to vent its wrath upon me. But I am not dismayed, though in pursuing this course I am acting against the law of nature. For the infamous man against whom I raise my voice was my teacher too, and ere he turned from the path of right and virtue, under influences which I will not mention here, he numbered me also in the presence of many witnesses among his best pupils. I was certainly one of the most grateful. I chose his granddaughter, the truth must be spoken, for my wife. The possession— Possession! Interrupted Dion in a loud, excited tone. The corpse cast ashore by the waves might as well boast possession of the sea. The dim torchlight was sufficient to reveal Philostratus's pallor to the bystanders. For a moment the orator seemed to lose his self-control, but he quickly recovered himself and shouted, Fellow citizens, dear friends, I was about to make you witnesses of the misery which a woman, whose wickedness is even greater than her beauty, brought upon an inexperienced— But he went no further, for his hearers, many of whom knew the brilliant, generous Dion, and Barine, the fair singer at the last Adonis festival, gave the orator tokens of their indignation, which were all the more pitiless because of the pleasure they felt in seeing an expert vanquished by an untrained foe. The wordy war would not have ended so quickly, however, had not restlessness and alarm taken possession of the crowd. The shout, Back! Disperse! ran through the multitude, and directly after the trampling of hooves and the commands of the leader of a troop of Libyan cavalry were heard. The matter at stake was not sufficiently important to induce the populace to offer an armed force resistance, which might have entailed serious danger. Besides, the blustering war of tongues had reached a merry close, and loud laughter blended with shouts of fear and warning, for the surging throng had swept with unexpected speed towards the fountain, and plunged Philostratus into the basin. Whether this was due to the wrath of some enemy, or to mere accident, could not be learned. The vain efforts of the luckless man to crawl out of the water up the smooth marble were so comical, and his gestures, after helping hands had dragged him dripping upon the pavement of the square, were so irresistibly funny, that more laughing than angry voices were heard, especially when someone cried, His hands were soiled by blackening Didymus, so the washing will do him good. Some wise physicians flung him into the water, retorted another. He needed the cold application after the blows Dion dealt him. The regent, who had sent the troop of horsemen to drive the crowd away from Didymus's house, might well be pleased that the violent measure encountered so little resistance. The throng quickly scattered, and was speedily attracted by something new at the theatre of Dionysus. The zither player Anaxenor had just announced from its steps that Cleopatra and Antony had won the most brilliant victory, and had sung to the accompaniment of his lute a hymn which had deeply stirred all hearts. He had composed it long before, and seized the first opportunity— the report had reached his ears while breakfasting in Canopus— to try its effect. As soon as the square began to empty, Barine left her post of observation. It was long since her throat had throbbed so violently. Not one of the many suitors for her favor had been so dear to her as Dion, but she now felt that she loved him. What he had just done for her and her grandfather was worthy of the deepest gratitude. It proved that he did not come to her house, like most of her guests, merely to while away the evening hours. It had been no small matter for the young aristocrat, in the presence of the whole multitude, to enter into a debate with the infamous Philostratus, and how well he had succeeded in silencing the dreaded orator. Besides, Dion had even taken her part against his own powerful uncle, and perhaps by his deed drawn upon himself the hostility of his enemy's brother, Alexis, Antony's powerful favorite. Barine might assure herself that he, who was the peer of any Macedonian noble in the city, would have done this for no one else. She felt as if the act had ransomed her, When, after an unhappy marriage and many desolate days, she had regained her former bright cheerfulness, and saw her house become the center of the intellectual life of the city, she had striven until now to extend the same welcome to all her guests. She had perceived that she ought not to give any one the power over her which is possessed by the man who knows that he is beloved, and even to Dion she had granted little more than to others. But now she saw plainly that she would resign the pleasure of being a universally admired woman, whose modest home attracted the most distinguished men in the city, for the far greater happiness which would be hers as Dion's beloved wife. With him, cherished by his love, she believed that she could find far greater joy in solitude than in the gay course of her present life. She knew now what she must do if Dion sought her, and the architect, for the first time, found her a silent companion. He had willingly accompanied her back to her grandfather's house, where he had again met her sister Helena, while she had quitted it disappointed because her brave defender had not returned there. After the interruption of the debate, Dion had been in a very cheerful mood. The pleasant sensation of having championed a good cause, and the delightful consciousness of success were not new to him, but he had rarely felt so uplifted as now. He most ardently longed for his next meeting with Barine, and imagined how he would describe what had happened and claim her gratitude for his friendly service. The scene had risen clearly before his mind, but scarcely had the radiant vision of the future faded when the unusually bright expression of his manly face was clouded by a grave and troubled one. The darkness of the night, illumined only by the flare of the pitch pans, had surrounded him, yet it had seemed as if he were standing with Barine in the full light of noon, in the blossoming garden of his own palace, and, after asking a reward for his sturdy championship, she had clung to him with deep emotion, and he had passionately kissed her tearful face. The face had quickly vanished, yet it had been as distinct as the most vivid picture in a dream. Was Barine more to him than he supposed? Had he not been drawn to her, during the past few months, by the mere charm of her pliant intellect and her bright beauty? Had a new, strong passion awakened within him? Was he in danger of seeing the will which urged him to preserve his freedom conquered? Had he cause to fear that some day, constrained by a mysterious, invincible power, in defiance of the opposition of calm reason, he might perhaps bind himself for life to this Barine, the woman who had once been the wife of a Philostratus, and who bestowed her smiles on all who found admittance to her house, seeking a feast for the eye, a banquet for the ear, a pleasant entertainment? Though her honor was as stainless as the breast of a swan, and he had no reason to doubt it, she would still be classed with Aspasia and other women whose guests sought more than songs and agreeable conversations. The gifts with which the gods had so lavishly endowed her had already been shared with too many to permit him, the last scion of a noble Macedonian house, to think of leading her as mistress to the palace whose erection he had so carefully and successfully planned with Gorgias. Surely it lacked nothing save the gracious rule of a mistress, but if she should consent to become his without the blessing of Hymen? No. He could not thus dishonor the granddaughter of Didymus, the man who had been his father's revered teacher, a woman whom he had always rejoiced that, spite of the gay freedom with which she received so many admirers, he could still esteem. He would not do so, though his friends would have greeted such scruples with a smile of superiority. Who revered the sacredness of marriage in a city whose queen was openly living for the second time with the husband of another? Dion himself had formed many a brief connection, but for that very reason he could not place a woman like Barine on the same footing with those whose love he had perhaps owed solely to his wealth. He had never lacked courage and resolution, but he felt that this time he would have to resist a power with which he had never coped. That accursed face! Again and again it rose before his mental vision, smiling and beckoning so sweetly that the day must come when the yearning to realize the dream would conquer all opposition. If he remained near her, he would inevitably do what he might afterwards regret, and therefore he would fain have offered a sacrifice to Pytho to induce her to enhance Archibius's powers of persuasion, and induce Barine to leave Alexandria. It would be hard for him to part from her, Yet much would be gained if she went into the country. Between the present and the distant period of a second meeting lay respite from peril, and perhaps the possibility of victory. Dion did not recognize himself. He seemed as unstable as a swaying reed, because he had conquered his wish to re-enter old Didymus's house and encourage him, and passed on to his own home. But he would probably have found Barine still with her grandfather, and he would not meet her, though every fibre of his being longed for her face, her voice, and a word of gratitude from her beloved lips. Instead of joy, he was filled with the sense of dissatisfaction which overpowers a man standing at a crossing in the roads, who sees before him 3 goals, yet can be fully content with neither. The street of the king, along which he suffered himself to be carried by the excited throng, ran between the sea and the theatre of Dionysus. The thought darted through his mind that his friend the architect desired to erect the luckless statues of the royal lovers in front of this stately building. He would divert his thoughts by examining the site which Gorgias had chosen. The zither player finished his hymn just as Dion approached the theatre, and the crowd began to disperse. Everyone was full of the joyful tidings of victory, and one shouted to another what Anaxenor, the favorite of the great Antony, who must surely know, had just recited in thrilling verse. Many a joyous Io and loud Evo to Cleopatra the new Isis, and Antony the new Dionysus, resounded through the air, while bearded and smooth, delicate Greek and thick Egyptian lips joined in the shout, "To the Sebasteum!" This was the royal palace, which faced the government building containing the regent's residence. The populace desired to have the delightful news confirmed, and to express, by a public demonstration, the grateful joy which filled every heart. Dion, too, was eager to obtain certainty, and, though usually averse to mingling with the population during such noisy outbursts of feeling, he was preparing to follow the crowd thronging towards the Sebasteum, when the shouts of runners clearing a passage for a closed litter fell upon his ear. It was occupied by Iris, the queen's trusted attendant. If anyone could give accurate information, it was she, yet it would hardly be possible to gain an opportunity of conversing with her in this throng. But Iris must have had a different opinion. She had seen Dion, and now called him to her side. There were hoarse tones in her voice, usually so clear and musical, which betrayed the emotion raging in her breast as she assailed the young Macedonian noble with a flood of questions. Without giving him the usual greeting, she hastily desired to know what was exciting the people, who had brought the tidings of victory, and whither the multitude was flocking. Dion had found it difficult not to be forced from the litter while answering. Iris perceived this, and as they were just passing the meander, the labyrinth, which was closed after sunset, she ordered her bearers to carry the litter to the entrance, made herself known to the watchman, ordered the outer court to be opened, the litter to be placed there, and the bearers and runners to wait outside for her summons, which would soon be given. This unusual haste and excitement filled Dion with just solicitude. She refused his invitation to alight and walk up and down, declaring that life offered so many labyrinths that one need not seek them. He, too, seemed to be following paths which were scarcely straight ones. "Why," she concluded, thrusting her head far out of the opening in the litter, "are you rendering it so difficult for the regent and your own uncle to execute their plans, making common cause with the populace, like a paid agitator?" "Like Philostratus, you mean, on whom I bestowed a few blows in addition to the golden guerdon received from your hand?" "I, like him, for aught I care. Probably it was you, too, who had him flung into the water, after you had vented your wrath on him. You managed your cause well. What we do for love's sake is usually successful." "No matter, if only his brother Alexis does not rouse Antony against you. For my part, I merely desire to know why and for whom all this was done." "For whom save the good old man who was my father's preceptor and his just claim?" replied Dion frankly. "Moreover, for no site more unsuitable could be found than his garden, in behalf of good taste. Iris laughed a shrill, short laugh, and her narrow, regularly formed face, which might have been called beautiful, had not the bridge of the straight, delicate nose been too long, and the chin too small, darkened slightly, as she exclaimed, "That is frank at least." "You ought to be accustomed to that from me," replied Dion calmly. "In this case, however, the expert, Gorgias, fully shares my opinion. I heard that too. You are both the most constant visitors of, what is the woman's name? The bewitching Barine." "Barine?" repeated Dion, as if the mention of the name surprised him. "You take care, my friend, that our conversation does honor to its scene, the labyrinth. I speak of works of the sculptor's art, and you pretend that I am referring to what is most certainly a very successful living work from the creative hands of the gods. I was very far from thinking of the granddaughter of the old scholar for whom I interceded." "Ay," she scornfully retorted, "young gentlemen in your position, and with your habits of life, always think of their father's estimable teachers, rather than of the women who, ever since Pandora opened her box, have brought all sorts of misfortunes into the world. But," she added, pushing back her dark locks from her high forehead, "I don't understand myself, how, with the mountain of care that now burdens my soul, I can waste even a single word upon such trifles. I care as little for the aged scholar as I do for his legion of commentaries and books, though they are not wholly unfamiliar to me. For any concern of mine he might have as many grandchildren as there are evil tongues in Alexandria, were it not that just at this time it is of the utmost importance to remove everything which might cast a shadow on the Queen's pathway. I have just come from the palace of the royal children at Lochias, and what I learned there. But that I cannot believe it. It fairly stifles me." "Have you received bad news from the fleet?" questioned Dion, with sincere anxiety, but she only bent her head in assent, laying her fan of ostrich plumes on her lips to enjoin silence, at the same time shivering so violently that he perceived it, even in the dusk. It was evident that speech was difficult, as she added in a muffled tone, "It must be kept secret. Rhodian sailors, thank the gods, it is still very doubtful. It must not be true. And yet, the prattle of that zither player, which has filled the multitude with joyous anticipation, is abominable. The great ones of the earth are often most sorely injured by those who owe them the most gratitude. I know you can be silent, Dion. You could as a boy, if anything was to be hidden from our parents. Would you still be ready to plunge into the water for me, as in those days? Scarcely. Yet you may be trusted, and even in this labyrinth I will do so. My heart is heavy, but not one word to any person. I need no confidant, and could maintain silence even towards you, but I am anxious that you should understand me, you who have just taken such a stand. Before I entered my litter at Lochias, the boy returned, and I talked with him." "Young Caesarion loves Barine," replied Dion with grave earnestness. "Then this horrible folly is known?" asked Iris excitedly. "A passion far deeper than I should ever have expected this dreamer to feel has taken possession of him. And if the Queen should now return, perhaps less successful than we desire, if she looks to those from whom she still expects pleasure, satisfaction, lofty deeds, and learns what has befallen the boy, for what does not that sun-bright intellect learn and perceive? He is dear to her, dearer than any of you imagine. How it will increase her anxiety, perhaps her suffering. With what good reason she will be angered against those whom duty and love should have commanded to guard the boy. And therefore," added Dion, "the stone of offense must be removed. Your first step to secure this object was the attack on Didymus." He had judged correctly, and perceived that, in her assault upon the old scholar, she had at first intended to play into the hands of the rulers, work against the old philosopher and his relatives, among whose number was Barine, for the Egyptian law permitted the relatives of those who were convicted of any crime against the sovereign or the government to be banished with the criminal. This attack upon an innocent person was disgraceful, yet every word Iris uttered made Dion feel, every feature of her face betrayed, that it was not merely base jealousy, but a nobler emotion that caused her to assail the guiltless sage. Love for her mistress, the desire which dominated her whole being to guard Cleopatra from grief and trouble in these trying times. He knew Iris's iron will, and the want of consideration with which she had learned to pursue her purpose at the court. His first object was to protect Barine from the danger which threatened her, but he also wished to relieve the anxiety of Iris, the daughter of Crates, his father's neighbor, with whom he had played in boyhood, and for whom he had never ceased to feel a tender interest. His remark surprised her. She saw that her plot was detected by the man whose esteem she most valued, and a loving woman is glad to recognize the superiority of her lover. Besides, from her earliest childhood, and she was only 2 years younger than Dion, she had belonged to circles where no quality was more highly prized than mental pliancy and keenness. Her dark eyes, which at first had glittered distrustfully and questioningly, and afterwards glowed with a gloomy light, now gained a new expression. Her gaze sought her friend's with a tender, pleading look, as, admitting his charge, she began, "Yes, Dion, the philosopher's granddaughter, must not stay here. Or do you see any other way to protect the unhappy boy from incalculable misfortune? You know me well enough to be aware that, like you, I am reluctant to infringe another's rights, that, except in case of necessity, I am not cruel. I value your esteem. No one is more truthful. And yesterday you averred that Eros had no part in your visits to this much-admired young woman, that you joined her guests merely because the society you found at her house afforded a pleasant stimulus to the mind. I have ceased to believe in many things, but not in you and your words, and if hearing that you had taken sides with the grandfather, I fancied that you were secretly seeking the thanks and gratitude of the granddaughter, why, surely the atrocious maxim that Zeus does not hear the vows of lovers comes from you men. Why, suspicion again reared its head. Now you seem to share my opinion. Like you, Dion interrupted, I believe that Barine ought to be withdrawn from the boy's pursuit, which cannot be more unpleasant to you than to her. As Caesarion neither can nor ought to leave Alexandria while affairs are so threatening, nothing is left except to remove the young woman, but, of course, in all kindness. In a golden chariot, garlanded with roses, if you so desire, cried Iris eagerly. That might attract attention, answered Dion, smiling, and raising his hand as if to enjoin moderation. Your mode of action does not please me, even now that I know its purpose, but I will gladly aid you to attain your object. Your crooked paths also lead to the goal, and perhaps one is less likely to stumble in them. But straight ways suit me better, and I think I have already found the right one. A friend will invite Barine to an estate far away from here, perhaps in the lake regions. You? Cried Iris, her narrow eyebrows suddenly contracting. Do you imagine that she would go with me? He asked, in a faintly reproachful tone. No. Fortunately, we have older friends, and at their head is one who happens to be your uncle, and at the same time is wax in the hands of the queen. Archibius? Exclaimed Iris. Ah, if he could persuade her to do so. He will try. He too is anxious about the lad. While we are talking here, he is inviting Barine to his estate. The country air will benefit her. May she bloom there like a young shepherdess. You are right to wish her the best fortune, for if the queen does not return victorious, the irritability of our Alexandrians will be doubled. When you laid hands on Didymus's garden, you were so busily engaged in building the triumphal arch that you forgot. Who would have doubted the successful issue of this war? Cried Iris. And they will conquer. The Rhodians said that the fleet was scattered. The disaster happened on the Acarnanian coast. How positive it sounded! But he had it only at second and third hand. And what are mere rumors? The source of the false tidings is discovered later. Besides, even if the naval battle were really lost, the powerful army, which is far superior to Octavianus's forces, still remains. Which of the enemy's generals could cope with Antony on the land? How will he fight when all is at stake? Fame, honor, sovereignty, hate, and love. Away with this fear, based on mere rumor. After Dyrrhachium, Caesar's cause was deemed lost, and how soon Pharsalus made him master of the world. Is it worthy of a sensible person to suffer courage to be depressed by a sailor's gossip? And yet, it began while I was ill, and then the swallows on the Antonius, the admiral's ship, we have already spoken of it. Mardian and your uncle Zeno saw with their own eyes the strange swallows drive away those which had built their nest on the helm of the Antonius, and kill the young ones with their cruel beaks. An evil omen, I cannot forget it. And my dream, while I lay ill with fever far away from my mistress. But I have already lingered here too long. No, Dion, no. I am grateful for the rest here. I can now feel at ease about Caesarion. Place the monument where you choose. The people shall see and hear that we respect their opposition, that we are just and friendly. Help me to turn this matter to the advantage of the queen, and if Archibius succeeds in getting Barine away and keeping her in the country, then, if I had aught that seemed to you desirable, it should be yours. But what does the petted Dion care for his fading playfellow? Fading? He repeated in a tone of indignant reproach. Say rather the fully developed flower has learned from her royal friend the secret of eternal youth. With a swift impulse of gratitude, Iris bent her face towards him in the dusk, extending the slender white hand, next to Cleopatra's famed as the most beautiful at court, for him to kiss. But when he merely pressed his lips lightly on it with no shadow of tenderness, she hastily withdrew it, exclaiming as if overwhelmed by sudden repentance, "This idle hollow dalliance at such a time, with such a burden of anxiety oppressing the heart, it is unworthy, shameful. If Barine goes with Archibius, her time will scarcely hang heavy on his estates. I think I know someone who will speedily follow to bear her company. Here, Sassus, the bearers, to the tower of Nilus, before the gate of the sun." Dion gazed after her litter a short time, then passed his hand through his waving brown hair, walked swiftly to the shore, and, without pausing long to choose, sprang into one of the boats which were rented for pleasure voyages. Ordering the sailors who were preparing to accompany him to remain on shore, he stretched the sail with a practised hand, and ran out towards the mouth of the harbor. He needed some strong excitement, and wished to go himself in search of news.